I know that this is a concern for many of you, and I know this concern of yours not because I can read your minds, but, but because over the last few years many of you have told me that this is a concern of yours. And by the way, it's a concern of mine too. And that is that your sons, your daughters, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews, so on and so on, at least in great part, have disaffiliated from our Catholic community. You raised them as Catholic, you raised them in the midst of the Catholic Christian community, and now that they are somewhat older, they have chosen to disaffiliate. And it's a huge concern of yours, it's a huge concern of mine. You know, there's a research group out of Washington, D.C., called Pew Research, and they have done polls and surveys, and they have asked, those who are willing to talk, of course, but they've asked our young people, now why did you disaffiliate? And so it's not, well, we think this, we think that. These young people have told us why they have chosen to disassociate from the Catholic community. By the way, not only the Catholic community, it's not only a Catholic problem, but they've told us their reasons. Some of the reasons that in these surveys and these polls that surface, some will say, I have friends who are gay, and the Catholic community doesn't welcome them, which, by the way, isn't true. But in their minds, that is stuck in their minds. And so therefore, because my friends are not welcomed, I'm choosing to disaffiliate. Okay, not true, but that's what's in their mind. Some have said, I watched my parents go through divorce and remarriage. The marriage wasn't working, and so and people need to do that sometimes. Sometimes marriages don't work. There are missing ingredients. But because of that, my parents were no longer welcomed in the Catholic community, which, by the way, is not correct, but in their mind, that is stuck in their minds, you see. Others have said, others have made reference to, and this comes up often, what we all sadly know now, that came to light, 24 years ago, when all of us became aware that there were a certain small percentage of priests who were doing nasty things to our precious young people. And every time I think of that, my blood pressure is rising right now. By the way, in the early 2000s, I took, with permission, I took a 2-year leave of absence from the priesthood, from the religious order that I belonged to in those years, because I was so disgusted with the crap that went on and how it was mishandled in the aftermath. So the point is not to talk about, rehash all of that again, but the point is some of our young people will point to that, and that's why I've chosen to disaffiliate, and I get that. But you know what one of the number one reasons that our young people give that's always near the top of the list? Want to take a guess? Our young people make the claim, they say that science says this, theology or faith says this, and they contradict one another, and I'm going to bank on the side of science, and so therefore I'm out of here. I disaffiliate. By the way, it's a false dichotomy. Science and theology, faith and reason do not contradict one another. You know, by the way, this is a recent problem. in our lifetimes. In previous centuries, previous generations, by the way, it was the church, our church. It was our church who initiated much of the natural sciences. You think of people like Descartes, Galileo, Newton, devoutly religious people. All of these scientists in previous generations. It is a relatively new phenomena that our young people now see a conflict between faith and science. But it's a conflict that really doesn't exist. And I'll speak to that in a moment. But you might be wondering why, Glen, on this Feast of the Epiphany, are you talking about this kind of stuff? And I'll tell you why. I'm struck by, these astrologers from the East. By the way, Matthew calls them, in the Greek that Matthew's gospel was written in, Magoia. And we don't quite know what Magoia meant or made reference to. Magi, wise persons, astrologers. By the way, and I haven't really looked at the three wise men in our little, but I bet they have crowns on. Do they? I've never really looked. Yeah. We call them the three kings. Did you notice in the Gospels it makes no reference whatsoever to kings? And yet we've made them into kings in our own imaginations. Nor does it make reference to that there are three of them. It says nothing about three. It says nothing about that they were kings. But in our own imagination, we've made them into kings, which is okay. But the point is, they were Chaldeans, Babylonians, same culture. And the Chaldean culture at that time had a highly advanced appreciation for studying, for observing the movement of celestial bodies and measuring their movement and so on and so on. In other words, they're astrologers. In other words, I think we can call them scientists, the three wise men. And notice that there's scientific research looking for intelligible patterns. And I can only imagine that their discernment behind that observation was, what is the great intelligence behind those intelligent patterns? But notice their scientific research led them to Jesus, not away from Jesus, you see. There is no conflict. And our church, mainline Christianity, has never been in conflict with science. Did you know that the Vatican has a celestial observatory? And one of their telescopes is in Tucson, Arizona. Did you know that? And staffed by Jesuit priests. The church has never been anti-scientific. The church has been the great promoter of the natural sciences. And so this phenomena is a recent development where our young people, they see a clash between faith and science. But I'll tell you, it's a clash that really does not exist. And maybe our young people see this clash between science and theology or science and faith because many of our contemporary scientists self-identify as atheistic, or at best agnostic, and you know what? Our contemporary scientists, yes, they are bright people, highly educated, highly trained. They have much to offer. But with all of their intelligence, here's what they're missing. And this is what our young people are missing too. If there is ever a clash between faith or theology and science, it means that we either have bad science or bad theology. Now, I'm not a scientist, but just living the number of years that I've lived, I can well presume that there is some bad science out there. But I can say this authoritatively, because this is my training. This is my expertise. I can authoritatively say that there is a lot of bad theology out there. And when this clash exists between theology and science, it's either one or the other, bad science or bad theology. They must necessarily mesh together. Why? Because both are dealing with the same universe, just different spheres of the same universe. So therefore, how can they clash, you see? You know, there was a gentleman in the early centuries of the church. His name was Tertullian. He was never, like many of the early church fathers and mothers, they were claimed to be saints. Tertullian was never, because he said a lot of dumb things. One of the dumb things he said, now that we have this new revelation in Jerusalem, we don't need the philosophy and the intellect of Athens, the city of Athens. We have this new revelation. And the church immediately pounced on him and said, "You're wrong, mister. We need both. We need the philosophy of Athens and their intelligence and their sophistication, and we also need the revelation of Jerusalem. We need both." It seems to me that faith without science ends up being nothing other than a bunch of sentimental gobbledygook. But science without faith can become self-reverential and transform itself into a pagan god of itself, you see. You might be thinking, why are you telling me this? I don't have any issue with faith and reason. I suspect you don't, but your children do, and your grandchildren do. And I can't talk to them. They're not going to talk to me. What young person, little old fat bald-headed priests, are not going to talk to me. But you can talk to them, you see. The moment needs to be right, of course. You just can't blurt it and say, there's no conflict between, the moment has to be right for that kind of a conversation. But you are the ones, in time, in a gentle way, who can talk to your sons, daughters, grandchildren, so on and so on. I shared these similar thoughts last evening at the 4 o'clock Mass, and then I went home and I thought, why is this? this happen in the first instance? That our young people, even our contemporary scientists, that they see a clash between faith and science. How did that come about? And I suspect there are multiple answers to that, but one of the answers that came to mind, one of the thoughts rather that came to mind for me, is the rise of fundamentalism, you see. The dumbing down of any sophisticated understanding of who God is, and of any sophisticated understanding of what God really stands for, and any sophisticated understanding of what God really stands against. The rise of fundamentalism has dumbed down Christianity. And the media picks up on that. And so our scientists today, our young people today, they're not here. Well, there are some here. By the way, the demographics of our community, we're a retirement community. We do have some beautiful young people. But, you know, when I used to travel for Food for the Poor, there are young people still in our communities. Less, yes. Why the less? Because they're listening to the media, who picks up on fundamentalism, who dumbs down any sophisticated understanding of God, and then our young people say, well, I don't want any part of that. That sounds stupid to me. And they're right. If I were forced to believe that dumbed down understanding of God, I'd be out of here too. I want no part of that, you see. It's become a huge problem, and my point is that this star, the symbol of this star that guides us to Jesus, is for all of us, people of faith and people of science as well. So when the moment presents itself, share with your sons, daughters, grandchildren, so on and so on, that there really isn't any conflict between solid theology and solid science. They must necessarily mesh together. They must. Share that with your young people. It's become a huge, sad